Good evening. Welcome to Garden Hour, brought to you by SDSU Extension each week at this hour throughout the growing season. I'm Rhoda Burrows, SDSU Extension horticulturist, and I will be your host this evening. Before I introduce our panelists, let me remind you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions at any point during the show, and we'll refer those to the appropriate panelist as we go. Occasionally, we will answer those directly in the Q&A box, so watch that. If you have typed in a question, you may find the answer there. Tonight's panelists will be John Ball, SDSU Extension Specialist and South Dakota Department of Ag Forest Health Specialist. John, would you like to tell us what you'll be talking about tonight?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm not in my office tonight. I'm out in the Black Hills where I'm working. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about some of the plants that are in bloom right now, as well as some of the pests that are be coming out of dormancy fairly quickly.
We look forward to hearing about it. Laura Edwards is our Extension State climatologist, and she will be talking to us tonight about what she's going to tell us.
Thanks, Rhoda. Yeah, I'll be talking about kind of spring climate, kind of what we're expecting for the growing season, and a little bit about spring frost dates and that kind of thing. So looking forward to visiting with you guys today.
I will go ahead and get started with my segment tonight. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is asparagus. This is a hot topic these days, both because we're starting to harvest it across the state, and it's also a good time to plant it. So across the top of the screen, you'll see photos with asparagus crowns. You see those long storage roots. That's where all the sugar and energy throughout the growing season gets stored into those roots, and then they furnish the energy to grow the spears in the spring. The ones on the outer two sides are young crowns that are at the age to be planted, usually either a 1-year crown or 2-year crown. Larger ones are probably 2 years, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. The center one is a crown that was dug up from the soil that may have been 4 or 5 years old. Those nice big thick spears indicate that there's been quite a bit of energy go through that plant to build up the buds to that size, and the size of the bud will determine the size of the spear. Along the bottom and along the right hand side as well, we have illustrations about how to plant asparagus. So we make trenches that are 6 to 8 inches deep. In heavy clay, I'd probably go more with the 6-inch depth. And if you've got a nice light soil, you can go a little deeper. So we make that trench. You can put a little bit of soil at the bottom to drape the crown over, as in the lower right-hand illustration there. And then you put in just enough soil at that point to cover the buds, to protect them from any frost that may be coming yet. As the plant starts to grow, it'll pop up through that. And as the plant grows throughout the summer, we keep adding soil to that trench until at the end of the summer, it should basically be filled up again. Normally, we just kind of make one long row of asparagus, but the lower right hand shows a diagram. The little squiggles are the crowns of an alternative, which is to make a double row. And so you're planting them maybe 8 inches apart in a wider trench, but that's a way to double them up a little bit and maybe make weed control a little bit easier by getting them closer together there. Next slide, please. So along the left-hand side is young asparagus. These are probably first or second year plants. We don't harvest until the third spring, and boy, that's hard to wait. But if you plant them this year in 21, that means they would grow through 21 and 22, and you could harvest them in the spring of 23. Usually we do a shorter harvest that first spring that you're harvesting, because the plants are still growing and building up those crowns that you saw. So you might harvest for a month if you've got a good crown started. Whereas normally you might be able to harvest a good healthy stand for 6 to 8 weeks. What we do is kind of watch the plant, and when we start, because the biggest buds will go first, those thicker stalks, and as we harvest those, then the other buds are released gradually. And so when we're getting down to those more puny types of spears, you need to stop right there and let the plant replenish for the year. So the middle picture is kind of what the plant will look like when it's growing during the growing season. You can leave the fern in the fall. It turns actually a very attractive golden color, and you can leave it through the winter if you want. If it has a lot of rust disease on, then I'd go ahead and pick it out in the fall after the first killing frost. Otherwise, you can leave it during the winter. It'll help protect the crown, and will also trap some moisture. You see the icon there, don't use salt. This was something that was done quite a bit by some of our grandparents, perhaps, sprinkling salt around the plant because the plants are quite tolerant to salt, and it would keep the weeds down. Well, unfortunately, salt destroys the soil structure. It makes it from having little particles of soil where air and water can move through the soil, and makes it kind of like a clay pot, especially if you have any clay in your soil. And so it makes it impenetrable over time to water, to nutrients, to air. And so we want to avoid doing that. In more moist climates, like further east, they may have gotten by with using salt for a number of years because it would wash through the ground a little bit more, whereas we don't have that kind of moisture to keep moving that salt through. So don't use salt. You can use a hoe and hoe lightly instead. There are some herbicides if you want to go that route, but let's not destroy our soil with salt. The lower right hand is 3 colors of asparagus. We have purple asparagus and we have the familiar green. White asparagus is done especially in Europe, and there are special methods for doing that. All white asparagus is heaping up the soil over the asparagus bed so that it's not exposed to light, and so it stays a lot more tender. I don't know if it has as many vitamins or not, but that's considered a delicacy. Guelph Millennium is one of the newer varieties that I'm a big fan of. It's a release from Canada, so it's good and cold hardy. It is a little slower to get going in the spring, maybe about a week. And that may be just enough to help avoid some of our frosts. So that's a good thing. It yields well. It's one of the male hybrids, so you don't get the little berries that you can get on some asparagus. And it is also known for being fairly tolerant of heavy clay soils, less likely to get crown disease under those conditions. So it's my new favorite. The Jersey varieties, Jersey Giant, are also quite popular. You may have trouble finding those in the next year or two because one of the primary nurseries that was growing those for the public is no longer growing the Jersey varieties. So if you see them and want them, you better get them planted this year. I presume some nursery will pick them up at some point, but otherwise look for the Guelph Millennium. You probably will have to get that online. I don't know if any of the local nurseries in South Dakota are carrying that or not. If they are, give them a pat on the back and be sure to buy some. Purple Passion is an older variety, and it is not all male, so it has both male and female plants, and you will get some of the berries on that. But it has kind of a more nutty taste, perhaps. And so I like the taste of it, so I've got some of it in my yard. It doesn't yield quite as much, but it's kind of worth it for the variety and for the taste. Next slide. Just cover other comments about things that are going on this week. You may have noticed your daffodils, if they were early, daffodils are starting to die back, and it's tempting to want to cut them back once the foliage starts to die. It can be kind of unsightly for a while, but we just have to bear with it, because during that process of the foliage starting to turn yellow and die back, it's sending nutrients back down to the bulbs. So if you cut it off too soon, you're cutting off all the nutrients for the bulb for next year. So if you want to plant them as an annual, that's fine. But if you want them to last from year to year, you need to leave that foliage go. Don't bunch it up, because then they're not all getting the light they need for photosynthesis. One thing you can do is plant other kinds of perennials that come up and maybe hide it a little bit. You can see in this photo towards the upper left, there's some peonies that are coming up and will hide the dying foliage to some degree. Once the foliage is fully yellow and starting to fall over, that means the plant is going into dormancy. And if at that point you decide you would like to divide up the plant, maybe it's been there for 4 or 5 years and it's starting to get kind of crowded, you can dig it up at that point and replant, divide up the bulbs, or you can wait till fall to do that. And just be sure to mark where the plant is growing, because once the foliage is gone, it's hard to know where that bulb is underneath the ground. So those can be divided at either point. Easter lilies, it's the time of year when the lilies are done blooming and maybe people have taken them home, putting them in your house. You can plant those in your yard. Easter lilies are actually hardy in our state, but the ones that have come from a greenhouse and maybe have been indoors are not hardened off. And so if you put those right in your yard at this point, you may get some sunburn, you may get some dieback, you may get some frost damage if you're still having frost. So you probably want to put those in a bright window and then do like you do with transplants, expose them to the brighter sunlight for a few days, just for a couple hours each day, and then gradually expanding that so the plant gets used to the brighter sunlight and the wind we have everywhere. One note, lilies are extremely poisonous to cats. Even the pollen, if the cat gets some pollen on its paw and licks it off, that can cause extreme kidney damage to cats. And so you want to be really careful with lilies in your house and cats. I have had lilies in my house and I've never had an issue with my cat. Apparently it was smart enough to avoid it, but not all cats are. Dogs don't seem to have that issue with them. So if you've got dogs in your house, you don't have to worry about that, but be very careful with cats and lilies. If you plant them in your yard, take them out and plant them in your yard, they will not bloom again this year, but they will bloom next year, not at Easter, because it's way too cold for them then, but they'll bloom about midsummer, just like most lilies. And I think that is it for what I have to present, unless we have some questions. Oh, when can you use a weed killer? Mostly what we're looking at with asparagus are two types of chemicals. One would be like a glyphosate or other systemic weed killer, and you need to do that when there's no asparagus present showing above ground. So you'd have to do that early in the spring, or maybe later in the fall, as you mentioned, when after the first frost, when the ferns have died back. Why are so many of my spears coming up skinny? You probably need to give them some fertilizer this year during the summer. Give them some nitrogen. Make sure that you've got good healthy ferns to feed those buds that are forming, and make sure that you're watering it during a drought. Once the asparagus is well established, it can take quite a bit of drought. Those roots can go down 8 or 10 feet, but you'll have better fern growth if you water, especially for younger asparagus. Well, overwinter in a large raised bed, 2 foot by 5 foot by 10 foot long. 5 foot should be enough mass so that the soil temperatures aren't going to drop too much. And by the way, asparagus has this characteristic where the roots can pull down or push up the crown to the depth it likes. So most asparagus will end up somewhere between 4 and 6 inches deep, no matter when, or no matter how shallow or deep it was planted. They kind of find their level that they like. Are these episodes taped? Yes, they are being taped, and we'll have more information about that later. Mulching asparagus, I would use a light mulch, not a heavy mulch. Asparagus tends to get crown rot, so you don't want too much moisture right up against that crown. So something like bark mulch is actually pretty good, or wood chips. You may have to give extra nitrogen if you're using that as those start to break down. Plants, so you can start asparagus actually from seed or seedlings as well as from crowns. And in that case, you have the option of either growing them as plants and letting them find their depth eventually, or transplanting them, planting them as plants and then digging them up in a year or two and resetting them. Either way can work. Are all lilies poisonous to cats? Anything that has the genus Lilium is supposedly poisonous to cats, in Amaryllis too, I believe, but all like the summer lilies, tiger lilies, all those are apparently quite poisonous. So want to keep an eye on those. With that,
Rhoda, I
yes.
actually have a question.
Okay.
So in Iowa, my husband, I was in Iowa prior to coming here, and my husband loved to map out the road ditches on where he should harvest, where he planned to harvest wild asparagus. Do you have any tips for gardeners out there and people who are looking to harvest wild asparagus?
One of the things we want to watch with this wild asparagus, of course, is whether or not the ditches have been sprayed. And so you want to watch out for herbicide. But old farmsteads are another good place if you know somebody that has access to even old abandoned farm places. Sometimes can be great places to get asparagus. Again, just watching if you're coming back time after time, that you're not over harvesting them. You might want to just throw some nitrogen or some compost on them to help them to keep bearing year after year. Normally in those kinds of situations, we're obviously not coddling those plants. They're competing against grass and so forth. They're able to keep going generally because we're not harvesting them so hard and so repeatedly. It's more kind of ad hoc that somebody finds it and it maybe comes back or maybe not. So with that kind of pressure, they're able to keep going from year to year.
Awesome, thank you.
Our next segment is going to be Laura, who's going to talk with us about weather and what's going on this year.
All right, you mentioned drought, Rhoda. I think that's a hot topic for a lot of us. We've been dry much the last couple of weeks as I'm waiting for the slides to come up. I know we got some rain up in the northwest, north central area over the weekend, and a little bit down south too, kind of all over. But we are kind of experiencing dry conditions in a fair bit of the state. So yeah, it's kind of a spring update today. I haven't done this webinar before with you all, and so I'm just going to throw a few things out there to think about for spring season, and maybe I'll visit with you guys again later in the season as things change. So, this is just a cool picture. This is actually where I live, northeast of Aberdeen. So you can kind of get a sense of the landscape where we are. That's a picture from the garden, not to the garden. All right, next slide. So drought conditions, this is something I just visited about. And I know Cindy Schnabel and I, well, really Cindy wrote a couple articles to think of topics to think about with lawn and garden concerns to start off the spring season, and things to think about as you're planning your garden. Also, another thing too, just with the current dry conditions, we can go to the next slide, Kristine. This is zoom into South Dakota. So something else to think about when it's dry like this is that your herbicide, your pre-emerge might not work so well if it doesn't get rain on it. Same with your fertilizer. So try to time that application when you think you're gonna get some rain, or when you're gonna irrigate it, when you're gonna throw the sprinkler on it. So think about that too with your garden, that, the same issues that we see in the crop fields, with pre-emerge herbicides, maybe not working so well this year in some of those drier areas. So, so this is just looking at the dry areas. East central areas of the state seems to be the nearest to average or normal conditions for this time of year. But I know a lot of folks are trending on the dry side, if not really bad drought up in that red colored area. Okay, next slide. One thing here, I'm getting a lot of questions this time of year about spring frost dates, and a lot of the state has just recently had, low temperatures below 28, still seeing some hard freezes over the weekend. Hopefully, tonight it'll be cool again in the 30s for a lot of us, but we look at a warm up here for the rest of the week, and I think lows will then be in the 40s. And hopefully warmer conditions. A couple maps here to share with you, and this is from our website with the South Dakota Mesonet with our weather stations. So on the left side there is the kind of median date of our last day of 32 degrees. And so you can see the color scale there, kind of reds and oranges. You're looking late April, early May. The yellowish is around this time of the year, May 10th to 12th, and then you get greens and blues and a little later. So you kind of see, you know, the southeast part of the state typically is past their frost date by now, but we're still seeing some cold temperatures last week and maybe this morning. On the right there is the same kind of deal for same kind of map, but for 28 degrees for a hard frost. So we're usually beyond that by this point. So we did see a little later hard frost than typical. But I think, again, you know, we're looking at a little warm up here and hopefully out of the woods as we look at the longer term outlook and looking at warmer temperatures ahead. So, all right, next slide. Soil temperatures. So I hear rumor too, so I'm kind of a hobby gardener. And just last year, we found a little patch of morel mushrooms on the property here, and we have wild asparagus and those other things here too. And so some little birdie told me I should be watching soil temperatures. So, and to kind of get a heads up on when maybe Rhoda can help tell me if I'm right or not on that. But for those of you who are looking at soil temperature for emergence or when to plant your garden, this is looking at our weather station data from SDSU, and this was the 4-inch depth, so looking 4 inches deep in the soil, under bare soil, not under sod, under bare soil. Those are the temperatures this morning. So to give you an idea, for corn to germinate and emerge, looking at least the average temperature of 50 degrees for a good even, you know, germination and emergence. So I'm suspecting, you know, some other garden vegetables and those kinds of things are looking for a little warmer temperatures. And just now we're starting to creep up again now that our air temperatures are warmer. So if you ever want to look at that, we have that out there too. We also have soil moisture and we have soil temperature under sod as well. I'm not going to show that, but we do have soil temperature under sod as well for those of you who are interested in that. All right, next slide. Also, to look at the forecast, I'm not going to show the next 7 days. I thought I had the next 7 day one in here, but looks like a little active weather pattern here in the next 5 to 7 days. And this weekend, we might see some chances of rain, but really not looking at any really big amounts, really less than a half an inch, really, except for the far southern part of the state. Might see closer to an inch total for the next week. So we're not expecting a lot of rain. After that, you know, 8 to 14 days out, this is what we're looking at. Leaning towards warmer than average temperatures to return. That's the left-hand side map. More likely to see those warmer than average temperatures all across the middle part of the country. And then on the right, you know, these are from NOAA, from the Climate Prediction Center. They have odds leaning slightly towards wetter than average, you know, kind of looking at this kind of active weather pattern kind of continuing, but I don't know that I have a lot of confidence in that. This time of year in May, at least on the eastern side of the state, our climatology is about an inch of rain a week. So we really need a lot of rain to be above average, and I'm not sure that I see that. But anyways, looking at warmer, maybe wetter, maybe a little bit of wet. And that get us through May 24th, or maybe through close to the end of May. All right, Kristine, we can go to the next one. That kind of gets us through the end of May. Not going to show too much. We don't have a really good way to show the last week of the month, but it looks like warmer than average is going to hold on for quite a while. And as we look ahead into June, July, and August, just looking at long-term, you know, kind of mid-season type of thing, you know, looking like the odds are more likely towards warmer than average to hold in through basically the heart of our growing season. And on the right side, that brownish area, orange brown shaded area, does show more likely drier than average conditions in June, July, and August. Not to say no rain at all, but more likely than not, drier than average conditions. So I think in summary there, whatever kind of drought situation we have now, I mean, I see very limited rainfall through the end of May, and we'll probably see some drought conditions linger through the growing season. So be ready, you know, with your irrigation systems, whatever you got there. You know, hopefully that means good news for weeds, maybe fewer weeds, but you might have to keep an eye on some of those insects, some of those pests who will like to eat your green vegetation that you've got growing if they're coming from an area that's more drought and dry. So in a nearby field or wherever, or a neighbor's place. So yeah, let's see what we have next. I think that might be, oh, yep. One last thing here, and I love to share this with master gardeners and hobbyists who like the weather. We have a group of volunteer observers that measure rain, hail, and snow, or just rain or snow, whatever, with this group called CocoRaws, the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. It's free to sign up, and I'm guessing a lot of you already have a rain gauge, maybe in your yard or in your garden, something that looks like this. It's like the Kelloland rain gauge or the Ken Hirsch gauge, if you guys know what that is. And yeah, and this is sadly was a year ago. My rain gauge kind of took a tip for the worse there. I think 2019 really wore it out, and we recovered it. We got it back up and running. But you can report on the computer or on an app on your smartphone each day, and it's a great record keeping tool for you to keep track of how much rain you're getting all year round, rain and snow, and a great way for people like me too to keep track of drought conditions and kind of see what's going on around the state. So anyways, I think it's kind of fun. It's fun for hobbyists like me. So yeah, there's my contact information. For those of you who are on social media, I do have Facebook and Twitter as well, so you can follow me there. And that's what I have to share there. I see there's a couple questions in Q&A. One is for you, Rhoda, I think, about grass cuttings for asparagus.
Yeah, I think both of them are about asparagus. Just a reminder for those who are watching that you can post your questions in the Q&A as we absorb this. Maybe not quite the news we'd like to hear from our climatologist to think about the long-term effects and what we might be going into for the next year. When you're planting out your plants this year, you want to be sure that you're thinking about mulching as a weed control, because that will also help regulate the moisture as well. Particularly tomatoes this year, to help prevent the blossom end rot, you might want to be thinking about putting down a good mulch. Just make sure it's not grass clippings that have been treated with weed preventatives, because that can be an issue. With that, we will turn over and think about trees, and John can tell us what the long-term effect of this drought is going to be on those trees.
Hi, Rhoda. Well, we'll go to my slides first here because that's just too depressing. But yeah, I'm going to pick up on Laura's stuff here. So first item, everybody, thank you for viewing this evening. And I took this picture today. I don't care where you live in the state, a crabapple is in bloom. You know, some bloom earlier, some bloom later, but they're all blooming now. And that's pretty traditional. I used to manage garden centers, and people would come in on Mom's Day to buy a crabapple. And I always thought, what's that say about Mom, really? But nevertheless, it's a tree in bloom, and people like that. But let me also say, don't be deceived. You know, in a garden center, everybody buys what's in bloom. And if it's not in bloom, they'll walk right by it. And so we see way too many landscapes that look great right about now. but June, July, August, September, they don't look too good. So don't be deceived or just sucked in by these beautiful flowers. And it doesn't mean don't plant crab apples. They're wonderful trees, but consider more. When you go to the garden center, don't look at just what's in bloom. Look at what might be coming into bloom. Now, by the way, this is a spring snow crab apple, and it gets a name because it produces double blossoms. In other words, more than the normal number of petals. And truly, when this thing is dropping the flowers, it almost looks like snow drifts on the ground. I've seen them just kind of pile up. And it literally does look like snow. Now, I'm in Rapid right now, and I have seen actual snow drifts with these petals on it too by the middle of May, since snow is common out here. But this claim to fame is this plant does not produce fruit. And a lot of people like that. They say, well, I want these beautiful flowers, but I don't want the messy fruit. And I'm with you. Nobody wants messy fruit, but a lot of crab apples have very attractive fruit. Red jewel, for example, those small fruits, red fruits will hang all winter long. Golden raindrops, as you might expect, is kind of a yellow. And I think we're missing out on something if we don't get crab apples with attractive fruit that provides that second season of interest, starting in the fall and even extending throughout the winter. And a lot of times this is your robin food in the spring, because the robins come back and there really isn't much going on yet. And a lot of these crab apples, they'll just hammer every fruit off it. Now, spring snow crab apple, not only doesn't it have fruit at the end of summer, it doesn't have leaves. And the reason for that is this is one of the more susceptible crab apples to apple scab. Now, you all heard it's going to be a dry year, or at least that's the prediction, and I'll go with that. But in the Brookings area, we've had just enough rains at just the right time that we're probably already seeing primary infection from apple scab, something that Rhoda and I talked about last week on this show. And so I know I'm going to be getting calls this summer. They're going to say, how could I get apple scab on my plant? It hasn't rained for a month. Well, the infection occurred in the spring. And unfortunately, we've had enough rains. We had a nice rain that kind of sat for about 10 hours. The moisture was on the leaves, and that's what it takes to really get the infection started. Now, if it goes dry, we won't get secondary infections, but it seems like the primary infection is enough to cause a lot of these plants to be almost completely defoliated by August, at least on our campus. By the time the students come back in September, these are sticks. For the rest of the year. They survive it. But, so choose your crab apples carefully. And there's a lot more plants to consider. And my next slide, I only have 2 tonight. I can get that next slide up there. Oh, there we go. I'm already getting pictures of this. I've gotten several in the last 2 days, these little sea mines that you see. And these are on your cedar trees, which are really junipers. And they're kind of a woody gall. You'll see them, and they have what we call these telia horns coming out of them. See those little horns, kind of like real horns on them? And in about another week, now these horns have got to get longer, and they get more almost like gelatin. And then they're releasing spores, and those spores are going to land on crab apples and apples because there's no real botanical difference between a crab apple and an apple. There's going to land on those. And for trees that are susceptible, and I might mention the spring snow crab apples, not very susceptible to cedar apple rust, just apple scab. But if on a susceptible plant, you're going to see this infection occur. Now, usually we get, as Laura mentioned, an inch of rain a week during May and that. So on susceptible plants, I often see these becoming infected. But this is also a good reminder, if you do have a crab apple or an apple tree that is susceptible to cedar apple rust, that we're getting close to the time of your first spray. The first spray for apple scab went on just when the buds were beginning to open. These are going to occur a little bit later because they haven't opened yet to release the spores, but I'm figuring about another week or 2 at the most, depending on where you live. Rhoda and I also discussed last week fungicides to use. And I do want to remind everybody that Captan, which is a very common fungicide used for apple scab, is not effective against cedar apple rust. There are a number of other products out there. We have them in our extension extras and such, but just make sure it is labeled for cedar apple rust if you're going to be applying it. Like I say, in about another week or two, and hopefully you're trying to spray between these rains that we might get, and that would be pretty helpful. Well, those are my 2 slides, so we can go just to me for a little bit here. But a couple things I want to bring up, and that is Laura mentioned morels, and I love morels. Everybody in the state should love morels. They're delicious. But every year, people send me pictures and say, is this a morel? Now, first of all, I don't like IDing fungi from a picture. What if you get it wrong? But I have people bring them into me occasionally, and that's always great. But you'd be surprised how many samples I get in of false morels. And false morels are not good to eat. So my reminder to everyone, if you're going to go out and do mushroom hunting, and morels are just kind of a wonderful thing to be going out for soon, make sure the first time you do it, first couple of times you do it, you go out with someone who's experienced in mushroom hunting and make sure that they are picking morels, or they would know how to pick morels. The false morels are different enough that once you get into seeing them, you won't confuse them. But I'll have to say, I actually get more pictures and samples, and I run across them too, of false morels out in the Black Hills than I do the rest of the state, but you can find them throughout. Now, what about the real morels? Those are the tasty ones. Well, a reminder here is that the first time you have morels, don't eat a lot of them. Some people have sensitive tummies even for those. And again, they're not usually good with alcohol, especially if you have a sensitive tummy, but they're great with butter. Now, Laura asked, when are they going to be coming out? The traditional is when lilac buds are starting to open. All right. And when lilac buds are starting to open, and it's already happening in Hot Springs when I was down there. It's already happening in Yankton and those areas. So it's not when they're in full bloom. It's when the buds are starting to open, just getting a little bit bigger. And what you want is night temperatures in the 50s, day temperatures in the 60s. And we're kind of having that now, or we're getting into that a little bit later this week. And the other thing you would like, and Laura's not giving us this one, is you'd like some warm spring rains. And I kid you not, if you can go out and you don't see a thing, and then you get one of these nice overnight soakers, those nice, gentle, warm spring rains that we all want for our gardens, and you go out the next day and they're popping up everywhere. So if it stays dry, and some areas are just bone dry, you may not really see a lot of morels. And I should also add, to kind of play off the comment about going out and picking wild asparagus, the Yule Gibbons sort of thing to do, is that, same thing with morels, don't trespass, ask permission to go out and mushroom hunt. And you can find some on public lands as well. Most morel hunters, in fact, every morel hunter I know, will not divulge their favorite patches, because those are theirs. And I've got a couple, and I'm not going to sell anybody. Though my favorite is, I did have a couple come in with a basket of morels a couple of years ago and said, well, are these morels? And I had to say, yeah, they are. I said, you wouldn't by chance tell me where you got them? And they said, no. All right, they're going to be good morel hunters. Well, the other thing I'd like to mention on Laura's presentation is tree planting. When she went through and was showing the soil temperatures, it's now warm enough throughout the state that we're going to get roots to begin growing, and that's what you want. You definitely want soil temperatures above 45 degrees, and in most of the state, it's actually in the 50s. Our problem with that, though, is it's also very dry out there. And as she pointed out, in the northwest part of our state, it is bone dry. I mean, it is literally dry. And if you're planting bare root seedlings, for example, for a windbreak this year, anywhere in the state, Even the Brookings area, which seems to be escaping the drought at this point, but we're still a little on the dry side, but absolutely in the Northwest, you have to water the trees at planting. There's a couple of studies that have been done that have shown the single thing that makes a difference in survival on bare root seedlings planted out is watering at the moment of transplanting. That doesn't mean a day later, doesn't mean a few hours later. It means is right after you put them in the ground. And every seedling should get a quart of water right when it's planted. That makes more difference than almost anything else you can do. And then ideally, it's going to get another quart in a couple of days and another quart in a couple of days after that. And unless we get those rains, those inch of rains, which we can get in May, you're going to have to at least hold that regimen for about 2 weeks just to get them started. During our last drought episode, which I believe was, I don't know, maybe 16, 15, somewhere in there, I can remember going out and looking at some windbreaks in midsummer and all the trees were dead. And, Laura mentioned, well, the weeds don't even grow. And she was absolutely right. When I walked down these shelter belts, the weeds hadn't even started. It has that dry. And they asked, what the usual question, well, what killed these trees? Did I get bad stock? Was it an insect? Was it a disease problem? I said, no, flat out. When was the last rain you had? And they would say, well, we got one 6 weeks ago. And I'd say, they didn't get enough water. You really need to water them. I said, well, I don't have time to do that. And I understand that. But it also means this is not a good year to plant if you're not going to go out there and water. And I really want to emphasize that. I know this summer I'm going to go out and look at newly established beds that are not doing very well. And the reason will be is they did not get irrigated this year. And, a lot of years we do get that inch of rain a week in the spring, and that gets us through this, and it goes a little drier in the summer, and that's fine. But for right now, watering is absolutely critical. A couple of other things I do want to mention is that right now for trees is a good time to just sit back. We're not pruning right now, trees or shrubs. We've kind of passed that window. So at this time of year, everything is leafing out. This is not a good time to prune. So your pruning should be done, or your pruning is yet to go. But right now, as everything's leafing out, just put the pruners away. The other thing is we don't have a lot of insects flying yet. So there's not a lot of treatments that need to be done. I'll be mentioning those over the next couple of weeks, because probably starting next week, we'll be getting a treatment time for a few insects and that. And we do have diseases that need to be treated. And Rhoda and I went over apple scab last week, and I mentioned cedar apple rust. But considering how dry it may be, we may not see a lot of diseases. We didn't last year, and I expect that's going to continue. Probably the biggest insect pest that we have going on right now, and by that I mean actively flying, is out here in the Black Hills, and that's why I'm out here working. And that's bark beetles, the pine and graver beetles. Now, these are the cousins to the mountain pine beetle that caused that epidemic out here. But this insect shows up during droughts, and it's always here, I should mention, but during droughts, the population climbs, and it actually becomes a tree killer. If you drive out in the hills, you see these pockets of red and yellow trees. And you think, well, I remember that with mountain pine beetle. Those aren't mountain pine beetle, that's pine and graver beetle. And during drought, as I mentioned, they can become tree killers. And so right now they are starting to fly. And so right now you do not want to be cutting down pine trees around your property. You don't want to be chipping pine trees around your property. Reason why, and I mean cutting down fresh trees and chipping them onto your property, because right now the insects will kind of key in on that smell, and they're going to attack the surrounding live trees. So you may want to back off on anything dealing with that. Now, I did have a great question here. When do you prune hydrangeas? And I like that question. And hydrangeas are pruned really in the spring, because hydrangeas are one of our summer flowering plants. And so those are going to bloom off new wood, meaning that if you prune them a month ago, for example, the shoots that should be forming now will still bloom yet this year. So our summer flowering plants and hydrangeas are probably our best examples, are best pruned at the end of the dormant season, March and early April. Our spring flowering plants, the ones you see in bloom right now, are best pruned after flowering. And so as we start getting beyond this bloom period, I'll be discussing some of the pruning techniques you may want to be doing on your lilacs and a number of other plants. But right now, I'll finish with this. I know I'm going to get a question on spruce and pines and everything else. And people will say, my trees don't look very good. What do I spray? This year, the answer's simple: H2O around the roots. So with that, Rhoda, I'll pass it back to you, and we'll continue.
You had a comment in the Q&A box that we've already taken care of, but somebody observed that the cedar apple rust ball looks a lot like COVID.
I had not thought of that, but my gosh, how many COVID pictures have we seen? That's better than a sea mine. I don't know who said that, but I'm stealing it. That's a great, not that we want any more examples of that. And I don't want to take it too far. Don't put masks on your cedar trees to prevent infection. However, I will stress social distancing. If you have apples or crab apples that are susceptible, you don't want cedars nearby. Now, it's not 6 feet, it's 2 miles. All right. So it used to be 300 feet, but they figured out that it was actually 2 miles. So I liked that. That was a great comment somebody had. So social distancing here, 2 miles. And that's a great separation between cedars and apple trees, and frankly, for you and people you don't like.
We have a question on cleaning up an area that's had old manure applied last fall. They plan to plant pumpkins to cover the ground and hold down weed growth. And they're wondering what they can use to kill the weeds before they plant. Sounds like we're trying to do a 2-stage weed control here. And some of it's going to depend what was on that ground before you put the manure on it, whether the weeds came in with the manure, so we're dealing more with seedlings, or if there was something like quackgrass or thistles or some perennial type of weed. One of the ways that a lot of growers are starting to go towards now that homeowners might want to take a look at, you wet down the ground and then cover it with something that excludes light. Manure tarps are ones that a lot of commercial growers are using because they're large and heavy and exclude light. You can also use something like cardboard and just exclude the light for a couple months. That can hold down quite a bit of the weed growth, and you could do the same thing with a heavy mulch when you're planting your pumpkins. To make sure it's mulched around, you could even use something like landscape fabric or some other kind of plastic mulch. So there are a lot of different options there. If you're looking to control seedlings, one of the things you can do is water it and then come over with a light hoeing just to get rid of those newly germinated seedlings. And you can do that a couple different times, and that can hold down the seedlings. If you're dealing with something that's more perennial, you could use something like Roundup or glyphosate or 2,4-D, depending upon the type of situation you're looking at before the pumpkins are planted, and not on a windy day. But this isn't the best time of year for those kinds of materials to get into the plants. So you would probably just knock them down a little bit. It's probably not going to be a permanent solution. So there's several different options there.
Say, Rhoda, we had someone ask about the use of grass clippings again.
Mhm.
Could you mention that? And I'll say for trees and shrubs, grass clippings tend to mat, and so I prefer a shredded bark mulch. But of course, they're asking about vegetables and other plants. So
Yeah.
what's your feeling on grass clippings?
And the heaviness, as you mentioned, I tend not to like as much for something like asparagus, anything that tends towards crown rots, kind of like a lighter material. But for things like around tomatoes and so forth, and again, we used to say when the main weed killers were things like 2,4-D that you'd wait 2 clippings and then it was okay to use them. But a lot of the materials that are used now to get the really persistent weeds are very persistent herbicides, and they do not break down in compost piles. And so we can't, if the yard has been sprayed with some of those like triclopyr or aminopyralids, you cannot use those grass clippings on anything but perhaps sweet corn, which is a type of grass. So be very careful with what has been put on the lawn before you use those clippings. The other thing to remember is that for the most part, it's much healthier for your lawn to use a mulching mower that breaks up those clippings into smaller pieces and leave them on the lawn. It helps it to protect it a little bit from drought, as long as it's not big clumps that are left on top that are shading it. So a couple different strategies there. Straw is a good mulch as long as there aren't weed seeds in it.
Say, Rhoda, I think we got a question. It says fire light. I'm assuming it's fire blight. I might be mistaken, but I'll go with that one. And I mean, that's a question we both can answer as we're kind of finishing up tonight. But for fire blight, when I look at it for woody plants, is that most of the pruning done during a dormant season where you don't have a lot of pressure from the bacteria. And a lot of our woody plants, a common recommendation is a copper fungicide, which does have some properties against bacteria, at bud break. But since the question's asked now, is there anything that can be done during this time of year to help reduce fire blight? What recommendations would you have?
Well, don't prune, especially
right?
if it's wet.
Yeah.
And I've taken the strategy these days of not pruning anything if there's rain forecasts in the next few days, because it seems like there's just so many different kinds of wood rotting fungus and bacteria that can get into plants and get started. Grapes are one of those. On older grapevines now, we've learned that some disease-causing organisms are getting in and attacking trunks and are spread during rain. If it has a chance to dry out a little bit in between, that helps it a little bit develop a bit of a barrier. Coppers, you want to be real careful about the temperatures. If it's cool and wet and the copper stays on too long, it can burn the foliage. So just be real careful about reading the label carefully and seeing what kinds of conditions it can be sprayed under.
Right, and I'll reemphasize that it was before bud break that I was recommending copper. You're right, you know, as a standard extension mantra, read and follow label directions. And that is a spray that can be a friend or a foe, depending on when you apply it. So right, it should be used very carefully. And again, for our woody plants, typically just before bud break. But I think that took care of that last question out there.
Yes. If you had questions tonight and didn't get them answered or didn't get them typed in, you have a couple different options for getting those answered. One, you can come back next week and type it in, and we'll be happy to answer it at that point. Or we invite you to call or email the SDSU Extension Garden Hotline. You see the phone numbers there. You see emails, so you can send pictures in. Or another option is down there at the bottom, extension sdstate.edu garden/yard. And if you click on that tab, there will be a pull down menu appear, and it will have problems and solutions on the drop down. And you'll see this graphic that's basically this graphic that's there, that kind of information. And then you click down further and it's got a form that's for Ask Extension. And you can type your question directly into that form. And it goes to experts across the state and depending upon the question, even across the country. And you'll usually get a response to that within a few days. Depends a little bit about whether it's the weekend and so forth, and who's available to answer it. But that's another option if you're looking to get some direct answer during the week. With that, we thank you for attending tonight. We thank our panelists, John and Laura, and glad to have you tonight. And hopefully we'll have you, well, I know John will be back next week. And Laura, maybe you'll have some better news for us later in the year. But if not, we appreciate your coming on and sort of giving us a heads up about what's going to be coming up. We hope to see you next week at the same time, same place. And have a good week in the meantime. Thank you.